Hi, everybody. This is the State of the School address. I'm recording this live from my basement for those of you unable to attend our in-person gathering on Friday night. Yeah, thanks for tuning in. I hope this is, I'll try to make this interesting. Maybe I'll give you some behind the scenes, like a director's cut or something, or I don't know, throw in some Easter eggs or something like that to make it interesting for you. All right. Well, uh, let's dive in. I'm gonna see here. I should know how to do this. Share my screen and so that you can see the slides as I talk. Here we go. All right. Oh, okay. Here you go. So first Easter egg. Why don't we start with this? I don't know if you have recognized it, but Charis has its own font, right? We have a standardized font that we use. The reason why I know this is because I've been reminded of it approximately 450 times. Every time I put something together, I forget to use the font. I just use the default, and then somebody reminds me, hey, we use whatever it is, Garamonder. So there you go, right? Standardized font. Okay. Now in this address, I'm going to be talking about this AMBA, right? And I'm going to try to connect it with our school in three different ways. Now some of you might be wondering, okay, well, why do we often in these talks have this indirect approach, right? Why not just tell us something direct about classical education? Why all these other stories? Well, one of my goals in these talks isn't just to tell, but to show, right? I try in almost every address, almost every message that I have to um, take lessons from the past and apply them, right, to our school, to our world, to our parenting, whatever, right? I'm trying to embody what we want to get out of classical education in a talk like this. So there you go. All right. So take a look at the statue, see if you recognize it. Some of you may, some of you may not, right? For those of you that don't, right, it is of Jan Hus. Right, it's in the center of Old Town Square in the city of Prague in the Czech Republic, right? This right here, right there's Hus right there, is a painting by Alphonse Mucha, right, from his famous Slav epic series, and it's a painting of Hus preaching in Bethlehem Chapel. Uh, if you're curious to know how much of a nerd I am, I actually have a print of this painting hanging up in my house. Now, unfortunately, Jan Hus is probably not a household name, and that's too bad, right? He lived 1370 through 1415. He's born in the south of what is now the Czech Republic. He lives most of his life in Prague, and he was a priest, and he wanted to reform the church. Without getting into all the details, his ideas were controversial. Um, when he was invited to the uh, Council of Constance, he thought that it would be a forum for him to be able to debate his ideas. But instead of having an open debate, he was imprisoned. He was asked to recant. And then when he refused, he was burned at the stake. Now, prior to his being burned, right, prior to him even coming to Constance, actually, the Holy Roman Emperor had promised Hus safe conduct. You come here, I promise I'll let you go home safe. Um, but the emperor rescinded this promise after Hus arrived. Right. The following is a comment on this from a modern historian. Quote, it is an indication of how small a matter the confrontation seemed, that the emperor repudiated his guarantee without a second thought, and that the entire case, which to us seems the central moment of the council, was regarded at the time as one of the lesser events at Constance. Right? In short, Jan Hus seemed like a failure. He tried to institute various reforms, but he failed. Even his execution was barely noticed, right? And within a short amount of time, he was forgotten by most of his people. Now, we need to be careful about judging things prematurely. Sometimes seeds take years, even centuries to bear fruit. While most of his contemporaries and their immediate successors did not recognize Hus's importance, with the hindsight of history, we can see Hus as a father to his nation, a father of the Reformation, and an indirect cause of the modern missions movement and cross-denominational cooperation. And guess what? It all started right here, from the simple ambo in Bethlehem Chapel in Prague, right from where he once preached. I almost said whence, right? That just seems pretentious, but right from where he once preached. Okay, so let's first talk about Hus's role as the father of the Czech nation. Now, Jan Hus was Czech, and in case you don't know anything about the Czech people, they are the westernmost group of Slavs in Europe, right? I don't have time to go into the entire history of the Slavs, though that would be a lot of fun, right? You might actually think I'm going into their whole history by the time you're done with this, but I'm not, right? But the etymology of their name should be enough to give us a general idea of the tragic nature of their history, right? Our English word slave is derived from Slav, and this isn't accidental, right? The link between Slav and the word for slavery is found in Latin, Arabic, Byzantine Greek, as well as other languages, right? In short, the Slavs were not among history's winners. In fact, many of the brutal practices that were later inflicted against colonial peoples outside of Europe were first practiced upon the Slavs. Right. So later on, when the great European powers were gallivanting around the world, seeing who could gobble up the most territories, the Czechs found themselves relating not to the colonizers, but to the colonized. Now, I'm going to butcher his name, but there's a gentleman named Wojtek Napthrecht who moved to the United States in the 19th century. Right. He was Czech. And he moved to the United States to live amongst the American Indians in the Great Plains. He saw the American Indians being marginalized at this time. He saw their way of life being systematically destroyed. And he saw governmental policies and social pressures that were hindering their ability to pass on their culture and their beliefs to their children. And as he looked at them, he believed the same things were happening to the Czechs. Through his influence and through his writings, the Czechs came to see the American Indians as heroes, right? The Czechs celebrated the American defeat at the Battle of Little Bighorn. They had summer camps where their kids would sleep in teepees and tell stories of the American Indians around campfires. My understanding is that this tradition still continues to today. And they saw in the American Indians an ancient and noble people that were seeking to preserve their way of life in the midst of overwhelming forces. And they believed they were in the same situation. Right now, the reason the Czechs thought they were in a similar situation to that of the American Indians was that at this time there was no Czech Republic, right? In fact, there wasn't even a Czechoslovakia in the 19th century. At this time, the Czechs were ruled by the Habsburgs, right? They were a non-Czech dynasty. And there was a ton of pressure on the Czechs to relinquish their national identity and conform with Habsburg ideals. Right? So, for example, before 1882, Czech students that wanted to attend their national university, Charles University in Prague, were not able to take classes in Czech. What's more, a number of the Czech elites went along with this, and this is actually not common in the 19th century. These Czech elites didn't see their national identity and their culture as something worth defending, right? They famously demeaned their fellow Czechs as, and I quote, a nation of plebeian lackeys. Now, to be honest, I'm not even sure what they meant by this, but it sounds pretty awful, right? I mean, doesn't it? Okay, so here you have this people that is facing pressure on a number of fronts. On the one hand, there are various laws and governmental policies pressuring them to conform. And on the other hand, there are cultural and social pressures discouraging them from identifying themselves as Czechs and living as Czechs. This was undermining their culture and making it very difficult for them to pass on what they most valued to their children. And in fact, by the 19th century, they had already lost a lot of their distinct culture, and they recognized that they needed to rediscover their lost heritage. In 1850, one of their authors, a gentleman named Havlicek, wrote, quote, "As a nation, our life was almost gone. This miserable generation had to be told the story of their great ancestors." Right? They needed a model. They needed someone that embodied their values and their hopes. And they found this model in Jan Hus. Had not Hus stood up to a great empire? Had he not championed Czech identity when he stopped preaching in Latin and he began to preach in Czech directly to the common people? Had he not shown tremendous bravery in his willingness to suffer and die rather than compromise his beliefs? As the Czech nation began to rediscover and reassert their national identity, they did it around Jan Hus. Right? In fact, one can argue that the reason there is a Czech Republic today is because of what was said and done from this alcove over 600 years ago. Okay, so let's pause for a minute and see if we can relate this to our situation. Because as interesting as this is, right, you're not listening to this talk to learn about the development of 19th century Czech identity. Right, let's try to relate this to our situation as Christians and as members of Charis in 2025. Wow, that's the year. Okay. So, well, we as Christians, I believe, find ourselves in an analogous situation to the Czechs of the 1800s. There are various laws in place that are making it difficult for us to pass on our Christian heritage to our children. Right? The Habsburgs that ruled the Czechs were relatively benign. They weren't throwing people in death camps or anything like that. They were sipping coffee and listening to Mozart, right? But they had an official educational establishment that furthered the values of the Habsburgs and thereby undermined Czech identity. So too, as Christians in the United States, we're not facing direct violent repression, but we have an official education establishment that favors the advancement of secularism and thereby undermines our ability to pass on our Christian identity and heritage. Right? I don't need to remind you all that right now you are all paying thousands of dollars in property taxes into an educational system that you are not utilizing, and then you are turning around and paying thousands more so that your children can attend here. There is real pressure on you, and this is a real sacrifice to be a part of this school. Outside of official government policy, there are a number of social and cultural forces that undermine our ability to transmit our Christian faith and our Christian practices to our children. Now, yes, there are things like the drag queen story hour and other, cultural war issues that grab headlines. But I think many of the cultural pressures are far more widespread, unnoticed, and that this makes them far more insidious. Right? Every commercial for a phone, Coca-Cola, or a Toyota, right, no matter how seemingly benign, is an implicit endorsement for consumerism. It's whispering in our ears, in our children's ears, over and over and over and over and over and over again, right? Things make you happy. You need things. Buy things. Your value is found in what you consume. The purpose of life is in consumption, right? Etc. Many of our Christian ancestors found this to be the essence of worldliness and believed that this type of pressure was far more dangerous and insidious than the overt sins that we tend to focus on. Right? Every Snapchat or Instagram thing, right, has built-in assumptions of what the good life is. How should one look? What brings me happiness? What is the ideal life? Every YouTube video, every podcast has assumptions built in of what it means to be educated, of how we learn, of what knowledge looks like, how we should acquire it, right? Like weeds choking out the fruit of a garden, these assumptions undermine our ability to pass on our Christian heritage. Like the Czechs, we need models. We need to rediscover our lost heritage and set before our children compelling and beautiful pictures of what it looks like to serve Christ faithfully. And that is our goal here at Charis. It is no coincidence that the essay that kicked off our movement was called The Lost Tools of Learning, and that our association's yearly conference is called Repairing the Ruins. We have a deep and rich heritage as Christians, but much has been forgotten and much is being drowned out by the constant noise emanating from our flickering screens. We need to embrace silence and fill our lives and our minds with models of goodness, beauty, faithfulness, courage, right? We need to know our heritage and to love it so that it will influence us and our children. Now, I'll talk more about this at the end of my talk, but if you know anything about the 20th century, then you know that the Czechs fell under both Nazi and Soviet repression. The rediscovery of their heritage allowed them to endure this truly dark age. All right. Next. If you visit Prague today, you'll find thousands of tourists crowding around Charles Bridge or groups of people waiting around the astronomical clock for it to strike. But if you go to Bethlehem Chapel, where Jan Hus preached, you won't find any crowds. Right? As I talk about Hus's legacy, please keep in your mind this simple amba from which he preached. Please remember his overlooked death, right? His death that barely made a ripple. And yet, 100 years after his death, a German monk named Martin Luther began to read Hus. And in fact, a turning point in Luther's public life was when he admitted that Hus was right about a number of things, right? In short, Hus's work directly led to the Protestant Reformation. But independent of Luther, a group of people continued to hold to Hus's teachings. They were called the Hussites, right? Named after him. And they later developed into the Moravian Church. Now, if you know anything about the 16th and 17th centuries, you know that there was a lot of religious persecution. The Moravians were not exempt. They were persecuted and largely driven out of Czech lands. In the early 18th century, a gentleman named Count von Zinzendorf offered these refugees shelter on his estate in Herrnhut, Germany. Not only did he offer them refuge, but he offered refuge to other persecuted groups because various Christians were persecuted in various parts of Europe. Now you think all these persecuted Christians would be happy, like, hey, we can live in safety. This is peaceful. But they weren't, right? They'd been hurt and they brought animosity with them. And this was a nightmare, right? There were Catholics that had fled Protestant persecution in different parts of Europe. And right, other Protestants like the Hussites who had fled persecution from Catholics. And when they got together, they brought their conflict with each other, and conflict started to break out on Zinzendorf's estate. And so he didn't know what to do, right? He wanted to try to create an alternative community. He didn't want to bring all this drama, this hatred and conflict onto his estate. And so not knowing what to do, he decided to pray, which is a good move, always, right? The Lord responded. There arose in Herrnhut a nonstop prayer meeting that lasted over 100 years, right? This community at Herrnhut continued to be small. It never got big, but it sent approximately half of its members on missions all over the globe, which in turn helped to launch the modern missions movement. So, excuse me, pause for a second, right? Right now, there are churches in every country on earth. Every people group on earth has heard the gospel, right? The modern missions movement that was largely responsible for this was launched out of Herrnhut, Germany, right? Not London, not Paris, not Berlin, not New York City. Herrnhut, a small middle of nowhere village in southern Saxony. Now, I know what you all are thinking. Wow, awesome. But wait, there's more. Okay. Early in his career, John Wesley went to Georgia to serve as a missionary to Native Americans. On the way there, his ship was caught in a violent storm, and he was terrified. Even the experienced soldiers were terrified, in fact. It was bad. But there was a group of Moravian Christians on the boat. During the storm, they and their children kept their cool and sung hymns. They encouraged the sailors to keep their heads and do their duty, and Wesley believed that they were responsible for saving the lives of everyone on board. And so, as a result of this experience, Wesley did a lot of soul searching, right? Why were the Moravians at peace and able to serve others? Well, he was helpless and unable to care for himself, right? Let alone care for others, right? He eventually came to the conclusion that even though he was a pastor, he was not a Christian. And this led him to seek the Lord and led to his conversion. After his conversion, Wesley went on to play a leading role in the First Great Awakening. All right, let's keep following this thread. Many historians argue, and I agree actually with them, that because of the First Great Awakening, England and the United States avoided the terrors and bloodshed that beset France in its revolution, right? Again, I'm making like a truncated version of the argument, but because of the First Great Awakening, we got George Washington and not Robespierre. It would be fun to trace this out through the 19th and 20th centuries and think about how different the United States would have been had it had a different founding. Right? It's impossible to know. And it's impossible to know what the modern world would have been like had the United States not played the role that it played in it. Right? World War I, World War II, the Cold War, and so on. The First Great Awakening was shaped in large part by Wesley, who was converted by Moravians, and the Moravians drew their spiritual ancestry back to Jan Hus and the things he taught in Bethlehem Chapel. Right? In other words, right, this humble AMBA helped to shape the United States, which has shaped the modern world. Okay, now this is interesting, but let's tie this more directly to Charis. I'd ask you to think for a second, historically speaking at least, how unique this school is, right? The people, other people in our school, right, when you run into them, they might do things like speak in tongues or not speak in tongues, right? Whichever is more shocking. Right, some of your friends from Charis might have baptized their children as infants, or they may be encouraging their children to be baptized in their own profession of faith. Some people at our school use icons in worship. Others think that any visual depiction of Christ is idolatrous, right? And I don't even want to begin to get into all the different things that people think happen to the elements during communion, right? So now you realize that Christians have killed each other over these issues, right? Not just this or that isolated group of Christians, but various Christians at various times for various reasons, right? So for example, when the Lutherans and Calvinists and the Catholics all hated each other in the early Reformation and were killing each other and persecuting each other, they could all agree on one thing, and that was that Anabaptists needed to be killed, right? And I don't mean that after the Anabaptists had become radicalized and violent and were sharing wives with each other and whatever, right? I mean, during their first decade when they were like, the Amish, right? When they were pacifists, right? Just committed pacifists and minding their own business, right? Okay, you see this picture right here? In this picture, this is an Anabaptist that was running for his life from his pursuers. The man chasing after him fell through the ice and was drowning. And so he turned around, pulled the man out, saved his life. In the process, he was captured. And because he was captured, right, he was executed. This is not cool. Okay. Now, even after Christians managed to stop killing each other, even after that, there have been fierce divisions, right? If our Christian ancestors in, say, the year 1600 could see the school, most of them, if not all of them, would think it was an abomination, right? Even in the year 1800, the school would have been unthinkable. And so that's worth asking. How did we get here? Well, I think we can trace the modern cross modern cross-denominational cooperation or interdenominational cooperation to the Moravians at Herrnhut. Count von Zinzendorf made it clear that he wanted to do something different. He wanted to work towards the brotherhood of all Christians and the renewal of all denominations. Right? Notice, he did not want to create a new denomination. He wanted to find a unity that transcended denominations. And that is what we have here. Right? As some of you may know, I am not only a member of my church, but an elder. Right? I have a duty as an elder to not only serve my church, but to uphold its particular statement of faith. But when I come to school, my goal is not that High Point Church does better, or even that churches just like High Point Church grow and flourish. Rather, my goal is that all Christians are served by this school. I want Baptist Christians and Lutheran Christians and Catholic Christians and Orthodox Christians and Reformed Christians and Charismatic Christians and Pentecostal Christians and Presbyterian Christians, right? All Christians to be blessed and served by this school, right? Our hope is not that this or that particular church would be served or that this or that particular church would flourish, but that Christ's church would flourish. There is one Lord, one faith, one baptism, one church. When I die, I'm not going into, I don't know, independent evangelical church heaven, right? And, where I'll look off in the distance, at my friends in Lutheran heaven or Presbyterian heaven or whatever, right? I'm going to be with all believers. The fact that we Christians here at Charis have not only overcome hostility, but can cooperate together is a very good thing, right? It's a huge thing. And this huge thing had its seed, or at least one of its seeds, in Jan Hus. Okay, now, as I mentioned earlier, in the 20th century, the Czechs had to endure the double plague of Nazism and Bolshevism. One of the lights in this very dark period was Václav Havel. Havel was born in 1936. After the communists took control of his country, his family remained committed to democratic values. As a result, Havel was denied opportunities, right? Because he would not join the Communist Party. He was not able to attend a university, and instead he had to try to educate himself. In 1968, when the Czech youth began to protest their regime and work toward greater freedom for the Czech people, Havel joined, right? They didn't succeed, right? Spoiler alert, the Soviets sent in tanks and crushed the rebellion. But the dissident movement continued, and Havel soon became a leader of it. He was offered a visa to the United States, but he decided to stay amongst his people, and as a result, he suffered repeated periods of imprisonment. By the late 80s, people began to rally around him and against the communist regime. After the communist government fell, he was elected president of Czechoslovakia. And one of the first things he had to deal with as president was the division of his country into the Czech Republic and Slovakia. Now, think about how the dissolution of Yugoslavia went down, right? Its legacy is war, genocide, atrocities, and ongoing to this day hatred and violence. Under Havel's leadership, Czechoslovakia was divided without a drop of blood being spilt, right? After the division of his country, Havel was elected the first president of the Czech Republic. Now, think of the task that he faced. He was ruling a country that had been a part of the Habsburg Empire for centuries. Then it went through World War I, and it had, after the war, when it was united with Slovakia, a couple of decades to try to establish itself in the midst of history's greatest depression, right? All the while, it was surrounded on one border by fascist Germany and on the other by Bolshevik Russia, right? After this, it was conquered first by the German Nazis and then by the Soviet Union. During Soviet rule, civil society was destroyed. Absolutely and utterly destroyed. Every independent business closed. Every church subject to persecution, right? And during this time, during these 4 decades, church attendance declined by 80%. Every independent farmer lost his land and was forced to work on a state farm. Every civic club from bowling to Boy Scouts was taken over by the state, and it was forced to serve Marxist ideological ends. People were facing severe economic hardships, right? But by the 1980s, they were literally living in a society that lacked the ability to produce its own toilet paper. And so they had to use newspapers in place of toilet paper. The police were repressive. There was a network of internal spies. There were informants, and the entire leadership class had been trained to be loyal to the Soviet Union. Sorry, I need a drink. Havel found himself leading a democracy that had no tradition of democracy. He had to rebuild a broken economy wherein all private enterprise had been destroyed for decades. He had to disentangle his country from the Soviet Union, right? It took him 2 years just to get the Soviet army out of his country. And then after that, he had to find a way to peacefully divide his country into two. And he did all this without any training, any experience in government, and even without a formal education. He decided that it would be best to lead not with policy, but with morality. Quote, "We have become morally ill because we have become accustomed to saying one thing and doing another. We have learned not to believe in anything, not to care about one another, and only to look after ourselves. Notions such as love, friendship, compassion, humility, and forgiveness have lost their depth dimension." Havel sought to restore not just economic or political stability, but spiritual health to his country. Okay, pause. Right, pause game here. To be fair, Havel had grave moral failings in his private life, and there's still a long way to go for his country, right? The Czech Republic is one of the most atheistic countries on earth. Okay, so we got to be fair about that. But apart from these shortcomings, Václav Havel is a model of what we want our students to be like, right? We tend to look like 5 seconds in front of us, right? If this bill passes, we'll have tyranny, right? Okay, this is what a 24/7 news cycle trains us to do, to focus on the present, on the immediate, on what's right in front of us. But focusing on the present does not form us, and it fails to prepare us for the future. Think about it. Whoever will be president when our children are our age is someone whose name we probably have never heard. Our children are going to face things that at this moment we cannot imagine, right? When Soviet tanks went into Prague in 1968, no one foresaw the Berlin Wall collapsing 20 years later. No one, right? No one foresaw 9/11 on 9/10, right? 5 years ago, did anyone think that we would have a global pandemic followed by a land war in Europe? I didn't see that one coming, right? So how do we prepare our children for the world of 2055? How do we prepare them to be like Václav Havel, to be able to faithfully endure prison and persecution and be able to lead? Well, I have 5 ideas, and that's what I'll end this with. 1, we need to reject the Captain Jack Sparrow fallacy. I assume most of us have seen the Pirates of Caribbean, right? Maybe I need to update my examples. I don't know, right? I'm not going to pick on the movie, but I have a severe disagreement with it, right? In the movie, Jack Sparrow is a selfish, thieving criminal, right? I mean, like, pirates are professional criminals, right? That's what they are, right? And yet he goes on in the movie without repentance or any real development to do morally excellent and beautiful things. This is false. This is not how actual people operate. People that habituate themselves to doing lots of small bad things end up doing, wait for it, lots of big bad things. Only people that have habituated themselves to being faithful in small good things have the ability to be faithful in great good things. The idea that one can be lazy, self-indulgent, and engaged in venial sins and still be a good person capable of doing morally great things is the single worst message we can send to our kids, right? Because our kids, on some level, want to do what their flesh wants them to do, and at the same time, they want to feel like they're good people, but they can't, right? Those two are in conflict. And, right, it is people like Havel that do great things. People like Havel that do great things are people that have prepared by doing many small things. Next, we need heroes. We need models. As the Czechs of the 19th century sought to rediscover their identity as a people, so too we need to understand our identity as Christians. We need, and our children need, our Christian heritage. We need models of what it looks like to live faithfully. 3, we need to pass down our heritage and teach our children to remember. Prime Minister Lloyd George on September 11th, 1918 said the following to the president of the Czechoslovak National Council. Quote, your nation has rendered inestimable service to Russia and to the Allies in the struggle to free the world from despotism. We shall never forget it. Almost exactly 20 years later, on September 27th, 1938, British Prime Minister Chamberlain, trying to justify his surrender of Czechoslovakia to Hitler and the Nazis, described the Czechoslovaks as a, quote, people of whom we know nothing. How different would the 20th century have been had Chamberlain known history and not betrayed the Czechs to the Nazis? Ugh. Okay. 4th, we cannot despise small things. When Hus was being burned at the stake, there was no way he could have foreseen the modern missions movement or interdenominational cooperation. He cannot imagine millions of people walking by his statue every year. He cannot imagine how his example would have encouraged first Czech independence from the Habsburg and then dissidents standing up to the Soviets. It was not decades, but centuries right before the seeds that he planted bore fruit. They bore great fruit. They are still bearing fruit, but they had very small beginnings. We're a small school. We have limited resources, but don't despise our smallness. If you are ever tempted towards despair, do not for a second think that you can judge what God is intending to do with this school. The fruit that it will bear may take centuries to ripen. 5th, we need to sacrifice to train our children in small things. Now, the most important book by one of the 19th century's most important philosophers was Soren Kierkegaard's concluding unscientific postscript to Philosophical Fragments. It initially sold only 60 copies. I mean, granted, he did himself no favors with the title. Fair enough. Many things of importance take time to ripen and become important. So much of history is made up of small but consequential actions, right? And these small actions, because they are small, don't make it into history books, right? So for example, do you know where the fiercest resistance to the Nazis came in Norway? From grade school teachers, right? They were a bunch of old women who resisted en masse to teach Nazi propaganda to their students when their contemporaries in Germany were going along with the Nazis. As a result of their resistance, they suffered. But they had strength to suffer because they were formed in a certain way, right? They looked at their Christian faith, their Christian heritage, and their identity as Christians. And that's what gave them strength to resist and refuse. It is not enough to tell our children what to do. We need to help them grow the moral muscles to be able to do the right thing. It takes courage to tell the truth. It takes endurance to stick with a job or a marriage. It takes patience to parent and endure trials. We will not get these qualities from Netflix or Instagram or TikToks or whatever, right? It does not matter how rich our Christian heritage is if we have no room in our lives for it. It does not matter what truth is spoken if our lives drown that truth out. Most of us like to think that if there were a moment of great decision, we would do the right thing. But if we are going along with the world and our flesh and many little things, odds are pretty high that we're going to follow the world and our flesh in big things too. We need training in little things to prepare us for big things. Sometimes this means saying no to things, even good things, to make space for better things. Other times it means seeing the things we're doing in a different light. Okay, now if you're hearing this and you're feeling overwhelmed, you're thinking, oh my gosh, I can't do this. Good. Mission accomplished, right? Spoiler alert, you can't. God asks more of us than we can accomplish on our own so that he may be glorified. He gives us grace to do all that he calls us to do. Now, oftentimes God's grace doesn't come to us like super soldier serum given to Steve Rogers, right? Something that just magically empowers us to do great things on our own. Often God's grace comes through other people or institutions like the church. Charis can be a means of grace in your life. Charis can be a community that supports and encourages you in the education and formation of your children. One of the reasons parenting can feel overwhelming is because we are not called to do this on our own. Charis is a place where you can link arms with others. Okay, so I'm going to pause here because I don't have a paid Zoom account, and if I keep going, it will cut me off. So stop this here, and then I'll make a second video with the logistical information. There you go.